over the weekend, there were multiple protests and clashes between pro-Israel and quote-unquote pro-Palestine demonstrators, one of them in Kirkland. I have seen pro-Palestine protesters before in Kirkland, just a couple, holding up signs. I've certainly seen that in Seattle, but the numbers were large, even in Kirkland, and of course elsewhere across the country, in New York. There were quite a few clashes as well. Both our friend Jason Rantz and Jonathan Cho were in Kirkland covering what was happening. Again, I said Jason Rantz will join us coming up momentarily to talk about what he saw and what he heard, and also what he really views as anti-Semitism that he saw on display on the streets of Washington state, but also anti-Semitism that he says has been fostered by statements from our members of Congress in Washington state. And then this Seattle Times headline that, it's not so much the headline, it was the picture. And I saw our friend Ari Hoffman who shared it, and I'll read what he wrote momentarily, but let me just explain the picture that the Seattle Times chose to put on its front page, massive, right under the Seattle Times logo. At first glance, you wouldn't, think much of it in the context of what's happening, but it shows a young boy, and he's carrying what looks to be a computer out of some rubble, and the description, I believe it's an Associated Press, or it's a New York Times article. A child carries family belongings after Israeli warplanes bombed Gaza City on the Gaza Strip on Sunday. So Ari Hoffman shared that, and he said, women at festivals were raped and murdered, and their bodies were paraded through the streets by terrorists. Jewish children are being executed in front of their parents, but the Seattle Times is trying to make you feel bad for terrorists in Gaza who started this. Cancel your subscription. And this is going to be central to the conversation that I wanted to have with Jason about it, because here you have, again, the Seattle Times choosing a photo of a child in the rubble that's left behind. And of course, your heart is immediately sympathetic for any child in that situation. But what Ari Hoffman is saying is, this is a child in Gaza, and here you have all these atrocities committed against Israelis. And the Seattle Times is choosing to picture destruction and a child amidst that destruction in Gaza. And so, a question that I had in my mind as we have these conversations around what's happening there is, what is the line between, okay, you feel sympathetic for these quote unquote Palestinians versus, as a humanity, people who aren't terrorists, who aren't part of Hamas, versus, when are you just being an apologist for terrorists? And where is the line there? And so Jason and I will talk about that momentarily. But another angle of this story that I think is pertinent for everyone to be paying attention to, and that we're going to talk about at length on the show, is whether the threat of Hamas and terrorist acts in the United States is something that ought to be at the top of our administration's radar. We've mentioned this on the show, and we talk a lot about issues at the southern border, and we talk about them in the context of how are they going to impact us in Washington state in our national security, our security domestically. One of the things we talk a lot about is the fentanyl crisis, and how you have so many Democrats completely ignoring the security issue at the southern border. Well, where is the fentanyl coming from? Up through the southern border into our communities, and it's killing people. And another thing that just baffles me, why some on the left refuse to really prioritize security at the southern border, is there's been headlines for years about people on the terror watch lists coming up through the southern border. And we know that there have been, hundreds of them who've been captured at the southern border, who've been caught by border security. And again, there's been headline after headline for years and years about this. And then you think about, well, how many have gotten away? And so there's this real fear, and I think it's justified, that Hamas terror cells have already infiltrated the U.S. through the southern border. And certainly Hamas has an anti-United States sentiment. And so that's a real question and concern, I think, that the administration needs to take seriously in the coming weeks and months, which is, do you have Hamas sympathizers or Hamas terror cells who, because of our porous southern border where just anyone can walk in, are now living among us, just lying in wait? And Bill Malugin with Fox News, who's been, doing just awesome work at the southern border, he, and I imagine this is why, felt the need to put out how big of an issue this has become. He said Border Patrol arrests of suspects on the FBI's terror watch list at the southern border. And he started in fiscal year 2017. There was just two. There were two arrests of people on the terror watch list at the southern border. In 2018, that rose to 6. 2019, it was none. 2023, 2021, 15. 2022, 98. In fiscal year 2023 to date, there have been 151. If that doesn't scare the hell out of you in terms of what these people are doing coming into the United States, and again, I would argue, and Bill Malusia noted this, he said there's also been over 1.5 million known gotaways since the start of 2021. Enough to fill 16 Rose Bowls. So that means that 105 million people, the Border Patrol believes, have crossed the U.S. border to Mexico into the U.S., and they just got away. You know, maybe they saw them on cameras, for instance. A lot of private properties have cameras. So you want to guess how many of those 1.5 million were terrorists or were individuals who wish to do harm to the United States? I mean, we really could only guess at this point. And so it's certainly something that the administration should be talking about. And if they're not acting with urgency to secure our southern border, to make sure that what's happening overseas right now doesn't find its way to U.S. soil, then I don't know, what level of incompetence Biden has, but that has to be at the top of the list in front of our minds.